We've all seen VR videos like this, so how do you not end up trending on VR Reddit or as part of a fails compilation on YouTube? I'll share some hacks that you can use even if you basically have no room. So to play room scale VR, the recommended size is 6.5 feet by 5 feet, which translates to 2 meters by 1.5 meters. That's great and all, but some of us live in California where people literally rent out closets for $1,200. So for those of us with less space, does that mean that we can't play VR? Or alternatively, there are people like JBrat who are playing VR in literal open grass fields. Is that a possible option? Let's talk about it. So let's start off with, why do they recommend room scale VR? Well, really, it's just so that you can have a more comfortable VR experience. If you watch any videos on the internet, you'll see a lot of people getting injured from playing VR. That's because they have too small of a space and there's a probability that they're drifting while playing. This means that you're starting in the center, but once you put your headset on, you might be moving towards like the wall or your furniture and not even notice it because you're in your headset. So if your space is smaller than the recommended room size, you are more likely to hurt yourself, or you have to pay more attention to your environment, meaning you're less immersed. But if you do have a smaller space, is there a way to get around this? And the answer is yes, there's a couple of different solutions. The first one is a more expensive solution. You could get a VR treadmill like in the movie Ready Player One. I actually have a video reviewing my treadmill that I've had for about a year. The problem with a treadmill is, one, it's expensive. Two, it takes up a lot of space still. And three, not every single game is available to play on it, especially if you only have a standalone headset like the Quest 2 or the Quest Pro. Other people have decided to just completely get rid of their living room furniture. I know some people who actually don't have a living room. Their living room has been deemed as their VR room. Or if you don't want to go that extreme, just don't have a coffee table and use that middle area in your living room as your VR space. Again, these two solutions still are assuming that you have some sort of room in your house if you're working with a really, really small space. But if you're working with a very, very small space, the biggest issue that you have to worry about is like hurting or injuring yourself. So earlier we talked about people drifting from the center of their play space while playing. That usually happens because you get really into what you're doing and you don't even know how much you move. One way to combat this that's not too expensive, it's about like $30 to $50 depending on what you get, is getting a VR mat. That's actually what I use. I have the one by Asterion, which I'll link in the description if you're interested. But basically it's like braille for your feet. There's different like textures on the mat, so you know if you're like in the center, towards the front, towards the back, etc. Without having to take your headset off. The thing with this is you do have to play with like socks or your feet, because if you're using shoes, you're probably not going to feel it as well. Now the VR mat is really good, but you still run the risk of hitting things in your environment because you will still have a little bit of a drift using a mat, probably 1 to 3 feet in either direction depending on the size of the mat. So if your space is really, really tiny and you absolutely cannot move from the center, then I would recommend getting a bar stool. Make sure you get a bar stool that swivels all the way around, like a 360 swiveling bar stool, and that it doesn't have wheels on the bottom, specifically because again, you don't want to drift from the center. And then swiveling all the way around will give you a much more natural experience in VR, because instead of having to use your thumbstick, meaning like using your controllers to spin around in VR, you can actually physically spin in your chair, and that will make it feel more realistic. Now you may be asking, well, I have a computer chair or something that spins 360, can I use that? I mean, technically you can, but there are some games in VR that require you to be standing height. Really, if a game is done well, they should be able to accommodate like standing or seated experiences, but not every game has this. So if you want to be able to play every game, yeah, the reason you'd want to get something that's like a bar stool height is so that you can still reach things while sitting down and the VR will still think you're standing up. If you do have a bar stool, the way to test if this is good enough and you won't get injured is literally just stretch your arms all the way out and spin in a circle and see if you have at least like a foot of space between like the tips of your fingertips to the wall. A reason that you want a little bit more room from your fingertips to the wall is because, again, if you're in VR, you're probably going to reach over or like, you know, duck and move a little bit and not even notice it. So that will just make it a little bit more safe. If you don't have a bar stool height and you only have like a chair that's, you know, a regular size chair, there are still a lot of games that are seated only, like really, really great games. For example, the I Expect You to Die series is a fantastic series, and it's completely seated. It's made and intended to play while sitting down, so you can still get a really good VR experience. You just might not be able to play everything. If you have a very small space and you needed to play seated, but you still wanted to have the most natural movement in VR, there is actually still an option for you. It's called Cybershoes. So they're basically like VR shoes, and I'll link this down below as well. It has wheels on the bottom, and instead of using your controllers to move forward or backward, you would drag your feet on the floor, almost like you're roller skating, and that's how it knows if you're moving forward or backward in the game. Okay, now for the unlimited space, like J-Rap playing outside in open fields. Like, why do some people do this, and is this something that you can do? This is commonly known as arena scale or free roam VR by the VR arcades. The reason you'd want this is because even when you have room scale, so the 6.5 feet by 5 feet room, you still need to use like your controller or something to be able to move around in VR. But if you actually want to be able to run freely, then having a big open space is an option. To make this work, I did message him and ask him how he got internet in the middle of nowhere. He said he used a hotspot on his phone, but that it really, like, you need to keep your phone pretty close to you, otherwise your headset will lose connection. So basically you can play VR in whatever amount of space that you have available to you, and technically you can even play VR while like sitting in your bed. It just might not be the most comfortable and you won't have access to every single game. So now that I've saved you from having to buy a new TV, consider liking this channel and subscribing, and I'll see you next time.